day, everybody. Welcome back here to the library, and don't forget to like and subscribe here on the channel because we've got great new content coming at you every Sunday. And of course, this week is our next installment of 1,000 Words or Less, where I have other authors come on and talk with me about their works, and they share a little bit from them. Of course, the only catch is it has to be 1,000 words or less. And I'm so excited to welcome our guests this month here in the library, Dr. Charlie Thomas from Mercer University. She's a professor of philosophy. And she is also, however, working on her first novel, a mystery novel called The Vapors. So, but in addition to that novel, she's of course also the author of several academic articles, and also the novel or the academic work, the female drama, the philosophical feminine in the soul of Plato's Republic.
It's a mouthful. It's a long title, so there's no shame in getting hung up on that a little bit.
All good academic titles have that great hook of a title and then the long subtitle. But I think I managed to get through it.
You got it just right.
So Charlie, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on. And for my viewers, I always like to say when I actually do know my guest, Dr. Thomas, who now insists that I violate all of my Southern principles and refer to her as Charlie, was a professor of mine at Mercer in Great Books programs, and one of my favorite classes, the Flannery O'Connor capstone of Great Books. So always excited to talk to Charlie Thomas.
I'm sorry that's hard for you, but
so hard.
At a certain point, we've got to acknowledge that power differential is behind us, and we're both just folks in the world. We're just people. That's right. And that was one of my favorite classes too, by the way. It's not as if I get to teach senior seminars on Flannery O'Connor to Great Book students very often. That was a special class.
Well, it was a great one, and viewers home, we recommend reading Flannery O'Connor. It's a crazy fun ride.
Yeah.
And especially if you're Southern, it's called Southern Gothic. Yeah. So Charlie, you are, of course, you're obviously an academic, and you have this great book, which we'll mention a little bit later in the show as well. But of course, you're on here today because you are working on a novel called The Vapors, and of course, you're about to share a little bit with us. But what do our viewers need to know about this work before you share it with us?
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and it's really fun to talk about this project because it's a side project. I have academics teaching philosophy, doing philosophical scholarship. That's my day job. So the mystery is really fun, but very different, and not something that right now I'm giving nearly as much time as I like. I was able to get pretty much a whole first draft of it done before finishing up during the pandemic. I started before the pandemic, but this is, as you said, this is my first novel, and I write enough to know that your first draft just gives you something to edit, and so I wrote that first draft with that kind of freedom in mind, that I didn't know what I was doing, and that I had this idea, and I found that I really enjoyed writing. And so I gave myself a first draft, and I've made some progress on the second draft, but it needs a lot more work, and I enjoy it very much. So even though the semester just started at Mercer, and I'm quite busy, so I'm not giving it the time I want. I have there's no fear or stress that I'm going to leave it aside forever, because it's just too fun, and I know that I'll finish it. So but for right now, it's sort of sitting beside my desk and not getting my direct attention.
Well, obviously here at the channel, we support all side projects of writing, because that's exactly what this is, the side project about writing. So,
right.
And then plus all the other ones that I have in drawers trying to get to the finish line. So I empathize completely.
Yeah.
So what exactly is the excerpt that you're going to be reading today and from the book?
Okay, so the general setup, you know, like many first-time novelists, I sort of start with my own experience unapologetically. And so one of the things that I do, and one of the things that I enjoy doing, is leading study abroad programs. And so the main character in this book is not me. In fact, I've been very careful to construct her with several different people in mind that I kind of have intentionally drawn particular character traits from, because it's part of the fun and part of the exercise for the main character not to be too autobiographical. But the main character, yeah, has quite a bit of me in her. She runs study abroad programs, and in this case in Greece. And that idea came to me, and in fact the whole idea of writing the novel came to me because a friend of mine, who's actually a visual artist, she's a painter, lives in Greece. I visit her when I'm in Greece, which is most summers. And 2 years ago, before the pandemic, when I was there, she had finished the draft of a mystery novel. And when I visited her on the island of Syros, which is as lovely as it sounds, I spent, you know, the better part of a week reading her draft, and then we would drink wine and I would give her notes. And she had another friend there from university who was also doing the same. So we were sitting around doing that. And by the time it was done, and we were talking, you know, talking every day about her writing, she said to me, you know, you have lots of opinions about this. It was a very positive thing. I think she enjoyed the conversations as much as I did. She said, you need to do this. And so I came home, and so we started talking about it there. And one of the things that I suggested was this study abroad motif. And she was like, oh my God, that's perfect, because publishers of mysteries want series. They don't want one book. And the idea is to get it published eventually, right. You know, not just to do it as a kind of a, yeah, right. And, you know, I am not quitting my day job, and I don't have that kind of ambition. But if you do this kind of work, you want other people to read it. So the goal is to get it published, and for mysteries to be published. I understand, and I've done a little bit more work figuring this out. You need to have one done, and another second one started, and a kind of a third one blocked out. That's a pretty normal expectation for mystery, first-time mystery writers. And so the great thing about having the main character be someone who runs study abroad programs is you have a sort of built-in mechanism for going to different places, adding new people, but at the same time, you have opportunities to build an ensemble kind of cast, which is some of my favorite mysteries. You know, you're returning to particular people or particular groups of people, and so it sets that up. So okay, so that's the kind of frame, is that this is about study abroad. And in this particular excerpt, the novel begins with several of the people who were going on this trip, on the study abroad trip. And in this case, they're teachers, they're not students, high school teachers. And it finds them at home, and sort of gives a glimpse of why they joined a study abroad program. So the excerpt I'm reading today, which is just under 1,000. It was a little challenging to edit it down to 1,000 and make it coherent, but I did it. It's fewer than 1,000 words. But this takes one of the characters, one of the teachers, Claire, and it finds her at home, kind of at the moment that she decides she's going to go to Greece. And I will say one other thing that you need to know about this excerpt is that I cut a big chunk out of the middle that gives a lot more content. She's sitting at a lecture, as you'll see. She's at a lecture, and I used this sort of frame to give quite a bit of backstory about the history and archaeology of Delphi, which is important to the story. So at the beginning of what I read, the lecture is starting, and at the end of what I read, the lecture is ending. In the actual chapter, you get quite a bit of content on the lecture itself, but I still think it sort of makes sense.
All right then. Well, we all look forward to hearing it here in just a moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Charlie Thomas with an excerpt from her upcoming book, The Vapors.
Thanks. Claire sat transfixed in the little amphitheater classroom, lit only by the lecturer's PowerPoint image on the wall-sized screen. The image was of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and it had been taken from just above the theater, so you could see the broken stones of the stylobate floor and an extra little depression where the Adyton had been. That was the extra room in the temple, a little lower than floor level, where the Pythia sat, took questions from the richest and most powerful political players in the ancient world, not just Greece, and spoke her answers to them in perfectly beautiful, generally incomprehensible hexameter. It had been Homer's meter before it was the Pythia's, and it would be Heraclitus's later. Claire was sure it was the rhythm of the truth. She'd never been to Delphi, but she knew the stories by heart. She could even quote a few oracular sayings in ancient Greek, even though she'd never learned the language. Some children are told fairy tales before bedtime, and others get lullabies. But Claire and her brother were talked to sleep each night with stories of the Pythia, the god Apollo who spoke through her, and their home at Delphi on the slopes of the twin peaks of bright, shining Parnassus. Professor Hale advanced to the next slide. It was a 19th century painting of the Pythia, perched on a golden claw-footed tripod, wearing a yellow robe and wrapped up in a dark red scarf that hid her eyes in shadow. A smoky mist rose from cracks in the stone flooring and snaked all around her. Her eyes were closed, but her face was the opposite of relaxed. She seemed to be concentrating intently on something within her mind, something not entirely pleasant. In one hand, the Pythia held a shallow bowl, and in the other hand, she held a sprig of greenery. Those bay leaves had always bothered Claire's grandfather, a high school classic teacher who otherwise loved John Collier's painting of the Pythia. He had a huge print of it hanging over his desk at home. When Claire and her brother would visit, they would find their grandfather at that desk reading Herodotus or flipping through journal articles about the ancient world. Claire would climb up in his lap and he'd read aloud to her from whatever he was working on. As she sat there and listened to her grandfather, Claire would stare at the red-cloaked Pythia with the haunted face and wonder what she was thinking. What was so troubling or complicated or interesting that her brow would be so squinched? Claire would furrow her forehead just like the Pythia, close her eyes and try to read her mind. She could have sworn that she almost heard a whispered thought in the back of her head once or twice, but she could never make out the words. After a few minutes, she would lose focus, maybe listen to another minute or two of her grandfather's velvety voice, and then climb down to do something less difficult and mysterious, like play Chinese checkers with her brother or go ride her bike. Hale was lecturing about the vapors coming up from the cracks in the rock. Claire knew that was to be the focus of his whole talk, actually, the swirling gray smoke that Collier had painted and that dozens of ancient writers had mentioned in their accounts of Delphi. In the ancient world, it was assumed that inhaling the vapors that rose from the ground at Delphi was an integral part of the Pythia's ritual. It even seemed to be built into some of the most ancient myths about Apollo's choice of Delphi as his earthly home. The lights came up, but Claire stayed in her seat, sitting still and trying to process what she just heard. The ancient sources had been telling the truth, or something like it. There was compelling scientific proof that a Mondri and a mole had been wrong, and the scholarly consensus now was that the Pythia had indeed inhaled vapors rising from the stones beneath the temple as part of her oracular ritual. Claire wasn't skeptical. She knew Hale was right. She knew it in her bones. Her grandfather had never accepted the findings of the French school about the vapors. In fact, he railed against it regularly. She wanted to run to her grandfather and tell him. It would make him feel so happy, so vindicated. When she got home, she'd call her brother to let him know. At least she would have someone to share the news with who would understand what it meant to her. But it wouldn't be the same, not even close. John Hale was still in front of the room, chatting with members of the audience who had questions or who just wanted to feel close to the great man. Claire didn't go down to talk to him, though. She was still shaking a little bit, and she realized she had tears in her eyes. How could she tell this man that he had made the dreams of her dead grandfather come true, or that he had confirmed that the beautiful denouement of her bedtime stories was fact and not fiction? How could she tell him that she'd been raised on a fantasy and that he'd just proven that it actually existed in the real world? She couldn't. No. It was better for her to keep her seat until she was ready to go and then slip out the back way, just as she had come in. Anyway, she thought, as her mind began to transition back to the everyday. She didn't know how or when it would happen, but just as surely as she'd known those vapors had been real all along, she now knew something else. She was going to Delphi.
Well, that is a fantastic excerpt for us, and I cannot wait to actually read the whole thing.
Thank you. I realized I missed a little bit. Part of what I took out was her grandfather had this theory about the vapors, and the French school, which actually did, this is actually true, the French school, when they did their excavation in the 19th century, archaeology was young, and now an archaeologist would say, we found no evidence of the vapors existing. But in the 19th century, the French school said there were no vapors. And so the context that I skipped was that her grandfather was never convinced of that. And so this new finding that there was scientific evidence of the vapors vindicated her grandfather's earlier ideas.
And for those of y'all at home who have never engaged in academic debates, these things can get personal.
Yeah, they can. Yeah, they can.
And that can be a whole rabbit hole in of itself. But I'd like to start maybe talking a little bit about this transition, the influence of making this transition from your academia day job to fiction writing, because obviously we've had a guest on the show before who's talked a little bit about the process of academic writing. And for those of you at home, if you haven't watched the episode, go watch it. My brother was the guest. But those are obviously a lot different mental muscles. But since those mental muscles both exist in the same head, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that academic mindset has influenced this process. Has it been a bigger help, or has it been hurt more as you've tried to let go of some things to be able to write the story you're working on?
That's a great question. So first of all, the story immediately comes to mind. I have a friend who's a novelist, Peter Selgin. He teaches creative writing at Georgia College, but he's published a lot of novels and short stories, and he's very he's a beautiful writer, but also very productive, And when I was working on my academic book, the female drama, he was also working on a novel, and we would talk occasionally. And part of my process with that book, I had a sabbatical. I was, fortunate enough to have time to write, and so I would wake up every day and kind of put in the time. And when things got going, I was actually doing twofers, where I would write for 3 hours in the morning and then go back and put more time in the afternoon. It was great, but it was hard. It was really hard. And so I was talking to Peter about it, and I said, sometimes I just have to walk away from the computer and just lie down on the bed and stare at the ceiling and try to figure out, I know that A goes to B, but I just can't find the path. And I said to him, do you ever have that? Do you ever have that when you're writing something and you just, you know that the connection is right there, if you could just bring it into focus? And he listened to me. He was very kind, and he just smiled, and he said, Charlie, I'm a novelist. I just make it up. And I was like, oh, but my first thought was, oh, but my almost immediately second thought is, I want that, right? I want to have that experience where instead of trying so desperately to get something that already exists in the world right, instead, you still want to get it right, but to be able to make up what you need to make it right. I wanted that experience. And I've enjoyed that part of this writing. Now, whether the one helps the other or not, or hurts it, I'm sure both, right? It has to be both. I wouldn't know as much about Delphi or the Pythia or Apollo or any of these things if I didn't do ancient philosophy for my day job, and if it wasn't my love. It's not just a job, it's what I love. On the other hand, academics don't know how to say their name in less than an hour. So being, trusting the audience, leaving things unsaid, not getting hung up on some sort of preconceived notion, but really embracing the open-endedness of the creative process. That's all pretty new and pretty fun. It's hard for me to say how it hurts. I'm sure it hurts, but it's easy for me to say how it helps, and that is that I know things that I wouldn't otherwise know. And so if I can switch into that mode and still tap in to what I know, I think it'll make the book better.
Yeah, kind of enriches the fiction by giving the, if not always actual depth, at least the appearance of depth.
Yeah, hope so. Yeah.
Which we aren't all J.R.R. Tolkien, who literally creates every detail of the world.
Right.
We don't all have that depth of imagination.
Right.
Now, so obviously your academic work there is on the book again.
Plato mainly, but ancient Greek philosophy and literature in general. I'm interested in the ancient historians. I'm interested in Thucydides and Herodotus, especially as they sort of set the stage for Plato. And I'm actually interested in Homer, as the sort of Homeric epics are the kind of Plato portrays Socrates as knowing Homer by heart, and then seems to know Homer by heart. So there's a sense in which Homer is behind Plato in an important sense, and I'm interested in that as well. But for me, sort of everything either moves toward or is connected in some way to Plato.
So, and Plato wasn't above spinning a yarn himself.
No,
we have
not.
Atlantis and the cave allegory of the cave and all this.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
So, as you of course, have spent most of your life immersed in these folks, as you started to make this decision to write this book, what drew you in particular to the mystery genre then, when your background is in philosophy? So what brought you to the mystery genre?
I love mysteries. I mean, it's that simple. There are a couple of and thrillers too, I guess. I've had there have been a couple of everybody's got hard times in their life, but there have been a couple of sort of episodes in my life that were pretty hard, and one of the ways that came out was I would lose sleep, right? I couldn't sleep, and I had never had that before. I'd never had insomnia, and I found, and I'm not sure that anyone told me this, I think I just figured this out for myself, that if I had a really good mystery that I only read in the middle of the night, that what would happen would be when I'd wake up, because if you have, I don't know if I hope you've never had insomnia, but if you've had that, what kills you is if you wake up and you think, oh God, I'm awake again, and I've got so much to do tomorrow, and I can't afford not to be asleep. And as soon as your mind goes there, it's over, and you're just not going back to sleep. It's inescapable. But if you can somehow avoid that spiral, you can get back to sleep often and go on with your life. And I realized that if I had a book that I really liked, but that wasn't hard and that had fairly short chapters, and that I only read in the middle of the night, that when I would wake up, instead of saying, oh God, I'm awake, this is awful, I would say, oh, excellent, I get to read another chapter of Louise Penny or Daniel Silver, whoever this was. It was key. It couldn't be hard reading. And it could be something that I could walk away from for days or weeks and pick right back up on. And so I've always been a reader. I've read mysteries, but not regularly, religiously my whole life. But mysteries sort of got me through a rough patch in that particular way. And and then became, so both of those two authors that I just mentioned, Daniel Silva, who sort of does thrillers, really not mysteries, and Louise Penny, who does do the Detective Gamache novels. I now I'm, you know, when a new one comes out, I'm one of those guys that, you know, doesn't wait for it to be cheap and goes ahead and pays $20 for it just so I can have it right away. So when I wanted to write something for fun, it was just clear to me that that's what I wanted to do.
All right. Yeah, you know, write what you love, and you and I, in our kind of pre-interview conversations, you know, I did the same thing when I first started out writing. My first attempt to write anything longer was a pastiche of Dracula, which is my favorite novel. So, yeah, sometimes just whatever that love is, it pulls you there. You know, kind of always come back to it. Now, also in our pre-interview conversations, one of the things that we talked about that I thought was really fascinating, I'd like to talk about, is part of your process of writing is that your actual first draft is handwritten, which I've done stories on handwritten drafts, but long works, I struggle doing handwritten drafts, or at least more than you know, maybe a handwritten fragment, but the kind of first draft is usually on the computer. So how is that worked in, you know, and I think beneficially toward creating the novel, and even, you know, expanding the novel? The fact that it was at first was handwritten.
Yeah. So I like physical books. You know, I have a Kindle. I read on a Kindle. All these mysteries I've been telling you about, I read in the middle of the night. I read on Kindle. So I've got no sort of beef with e-texts or readers, but I do like physical books, and I like journals, and so that just is in me. So that's like ingredient number one. That's just inside me. But I started writing the book while I was in Greece. I was with these friends, and I remember where I wrote the first section, and part of what I read today is related to the very first part of the book that I wrote. And it was sitting on the beach before lunch. And I'd gone, my friend who I was traveling with had bought some journals because he likes books and writing and sketching too. And he just gave me one of his journals. And so I started writing that day on the beach in that book. And I couldn't stop. And so I just kept going with that journal. And then before I flew back to the States, I had to go through Athens. And so I went to the stationery store where he bought those journals, and I bought a few more so that I could just stick with it. And so in a way, that's just sort of accidental. I didn't plan it. But, you know, when I'm thinking about it now, and after we talked about it last week or whenever we talked about it, I think part of it too is so much of my work is right here, you know, my academic work, I'm typing, everything in the world happens on email. Now, and we're in the pandemic, of course, it's even more than that, Zoom, you know, all the time. And there was just something physically lovely about sitting in my chair with a cup of coffee and a pen and these journals and filling them up. And so I love it. I'm sort of committed now to that as a process, something quiet about it, and really almost meditative. And again, it's like a different posture. Sitting back and writing is very different from, you know, this, which I still, you know, the second draft, and I know you want me to talk about this, so I will. Second draft is typed in, right? You've got to get it. You got to get it in a form that you can.
Editors don't want to read our handwriting.
No, and you can't, you got to think in chunks. You got to think about structure, and you can't move stuff around very easily in handwritten journals. But here was one of the surprises. So I got, you know, there's certainly things missing, but a full arc, beginning, middle, and end, in 3 of these journals that I've described, these, you know, just blank page journals. Between the 3, I mean, it totaled up to, you know, about 500 pages of handwritten stuff. And my handwriting's not tiny. It's not huge, but it's not tiny. And the pages, I should have brought one of those journals with me, but the pages are probably, you know, maybe 8 inches tall, 8 by 6 or something like that. So I figured two, maybe three, 2.5 of those pages would be a typed page. So when I sat down, and I really spent a lot of time this summer, I did some of this during the pandemic, but I spent a lot of time this summer moving from the handwritten draft into putting it into word processor, but editing as I went and moving things around. I had a better sense of the structure, and so I was taking things from different parts of the journal and putting them in the order that I thought they needed to go into. I had sort of section titles and fitting things in, thinking about how to weave certain part of the story through the order of things. And what blew my mind is, instead of 2.5 handwritten pages going into a typed page, instead of that, I was getting, it was taking a more than a typed page to finish one handwritten page. So I'm not done yet, but I think I'm on pace. If I just used everything, I'm on pace for like 600 or 700 pages, which is not what anybody wants or needs. But it threw me back to this other thing I already mentioned, which is that publishers want more than one book if they're going to sign somebody as a new mystery author. And so now, as I'm working from the handwritten pages into a typed draft, I'm actually not just thinking, what order do I want these things in, or how do I edit it, but I'm thinking, does this belong in this book or in another one? And I'm actually confident that I have the beginning of two different novels in what I've already written, and maybe a little bit of a third.
One of the real fascinating things is you're certainly talking about, and I've found, is just how you start off with one plan, and the plan can change so dramatically from what you think it is, and you realize by almost accident, just from the creative process, you actually were being way more ambitious than you thought you were being.
Yeah, totally.
And if you embrace that, it's really fun, and to keep building and seeing where things will lead you, rather than just trying to force it into the peg holes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think staring at a blank page is really, really hard. But the idea that that for the second book I won't be starting with a blank page, maybe even for the third one, that's really, it makes you I don't know, it makes you feel wealthy, I think, sort of, like you have this surplus of what you need.
Well, it's always good to have an embarrassment of riches.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, Charlie, thank you so much for coming on time, because I know we're starting to run out of time here. So everyone, please make sure you be on the lookout for whenever Charlie Thomas'
book
mystery comes out. But in the meantime, check out the female drama, The Philosophical Feminine in the Soul of the Plato's Republic.
If you've read The Republic, you might like that book. I understand that it's not for everybody. I have some friends who picked it up just because they like me, and they were like, "Oh." That's like, if you haven't read The Republic, it's probably not for you. But I think it's readable.
Definitely enjoyed my time in Great Books program exploring the ancient Greeks, but I will admit to be more of a fan of Aristotle than I was of Plato.
Well, maybe you do need my book.
I probably do. People probably need always tell me, though, how is it that you liked Aristotle more? It's like, just because he came up with an answer.
No, I understand. Aristotle's comforting in ways that Plato isn't.
Though, as John Green likes to say, Aristotle's wrong about everything. So how good is that? Well, again, thank you, Charlie Thomas, for coming on the show and talking with us. And we look forward to whenever the mystery stories get complete and get out there, because we all want to hear more from than what you just read to us today.
You will be among the first to know.
We'll promote it all across the channel here whenever it happens.
Thank you so much.
Well, Charlie, thank you so much for coming on today. Everyone, don't forget to like and subscribe. because we got new content coming at you every Sunday here on the channel. And everyone have a wonderful day. And Charlie, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Seriously.